Alrighty, I think we're ready to begin. Thank you all so much for being here today. And Carolyn, you can take it away.
Thanks so much, Sam. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you being here for the timely and important topic of the future of our electric grid and what's at stake for communities. My name is Carolyn Dykema, and I'm a senior project manager here at Acadia Center, but I'm also a former local and state elected official, so I know firsthand the opportunities and challenges that communities face as we plan for reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy future. And it's great to see folks in the audience here today. This webinar is part of Acadia Center's Communities and Clean Grid project, which is grounded in the belief that municipal leaders, on behalf of the residents they serve, play a vital role in shaping the future energy grid and how our communities are powered. As our energy system evolves to meet both growing electricity demand and the shift to cleaner sources of power, the need for new and upgraded transmission infrastructure, those large power lines that move energy from where it's generated to where it's needed, will only increase. How, where, and when we build these power lines and related infrastructure has significant implications for cities and towns. It will affect everything from local development to energy affordability to reliability during extreme weather. Yet municipal voices are rarely at the table when decisions about this infrastructure are made. Today's presentation and Acadia Center's Communities and Clean Grid program more broadly is designed to provide information and tools that empower cities and towns to understand and meaningfully participate in decisions about how the future grid is planned, developed, and managed. It's our hope that communities won't just be impacted by changes to the power grid, but actively help guide them. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. This presentation will be about 30 minutes long, and it will be followed by a period of audience Q&A. If you do have a question, please type it into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be addressing as many questions as we can at the end of the formal presentation. We'll also be recording the session today, and we'll share it on the Acadia Center website at acadiacenter.org, hopefully within the next day or two. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Joe LaRusso.
Thank you, Carolyn. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you for today's presentation about the future grid and what's at stake for communities. Before we get underway, I would like to take a moment to tell you a little bit about Acadia Center. Acadia Center is a climate and clean energy nonprofit headquartered in Maine and working across the Northeast US and Canada. We're engaged in research, advocacy, and initiatives to implement effective clean energy solutions for a livable climate and a stronger, more equitable economy. I am a senior advocate at Acadia Center. Before that, I worked at the City of Boston under 4 mayors and served as the city's energy finance manager. It was while I was working on energy efficiency and clean energy projects for the city that I became interested in regional grid issues. It had become clear to me that every goal the city was seeking to accomplish, to reduce the amount of energy it used, to reduce the amounts it spent on energy, and to reduce the emissions associated with its energy use, all depended on the design and operation of the region's electric grid. And that is what I'm looking forward to speaking with you about today. Well, I think it's always been true that the electric grid has an enormous impact on the success or failure of local government's initiatives. Regional grid policy is taking on new importance now because the grid is about to undergo an enormous change. To give you some idea of the magnitude and pace of that change, consider for a moment that the grid that took a century to build is about to double in size in just the next 25 years. This has enormous implications for New England cities and towns. Before I tell you more about the specific changes that are to come, let me pause to say something about the purpose of today's webinar. It's threefold. To discuss the remaking of the electric grid that is currently underway, to convey the importance of participating in the remaking of the electric grid via stakeholder engagement, and to suggest how meaningful stakeholder engagement is possible given the scarcity of time and resources. Now let me return to telling you more about the ways that the grid is about to be transformed. Acadia Center and Clean Air Task Force recently published a report titled "The Energy is About to Shift." The report examines the critical role that community engagement will play in meeting New England's 2050 decarbonization goals and highlights the magnitude of the changes that are about to take place on the grid. The report estimated the magnitude of change that will occur between 2020 and 2050 with respect to 6 different features of the regional grid. The first such feature is installed electric generation capacity, the total electricity producing capacity of all the electric power generating facilities in the region. This will more than triple from 2020's 43 gigawatts to 145 gigawatts in 2050. The second feature is the share of total annual power that is produced by renewable energy resources. This will increase from just 7.1% of all the electricity the region produces and uses annually to 84% of the electricity we use. The next feature, annual end-use electric load, the total amount of electricity consumed by end uses like heating, cooling, lighting, and appliances across the entire region each year will double. The region's peak demand, that 1 hour of the year when the grid is producing and delivering more electricity than any other hour, will likely almost double from the historical peak of 28 gigawatts to 55 gigawatts. The region's capacity to share power with other separate power grids in New York and Canada will more than quadruple. And the amount of electricity New England imports from those neighboring New York and Canadian grids will increase by 46%. Now that we've described the fundamental changes to the grid that will take place over the next 25 years, I'd like to pause to think about the central importance of the grid to New Englanders and the communities in which they live. Let's ask a level-setting question about the grid. What is it? I think that question was best answered recently by former Federal Energy Regulatory Commissioner Alison Clements. This is what she said. The transmission system, the electricity system, is the backbone of the U.S. economy. It is about our national security. It is about our international economic competitiveness. It is about cost for customers. It is about resilience as weather patterns change. Security, competitiveness, resilience, and cost. These are national concerns, to be sure, but I think you'll agree that they are fundamentally local concerns first. The prosperity of the New England economy depends on the security, competitiveness, and the resilience of New England communities and their ability to sustain affordable standards of living. The prosperity of the national economy depends in turn on the health of regional and state economies, including New England's. With all of that in mind, let's complete Alison Clements' statement about the electric grid. When we think about this system that we've been running for 50 to 100 years, it is increasingly old, clunky, and outdated. Old, clunky, and outdated. Not very reassuring, is it? Commissioner Clements' statement applies to the New England grid as much as it applies to other regional grids. Here in New England, for example, most of the region's 9,000 miles of transmission lines carry conductors that were designed more than half a century ago. But reliance on antiquated technology isn't the only condition that characterizes New England's electric grid. It is also the advanced age of much of the grid itself. For example, the average age of the equipment on Eversource's 49-mile-long X178 transmission line in New Hampshire is 45 years, just years away from the 50-year useful life usually attributed to transmission equipment. But the fact that New England's electric grid is old, clunky, and outdated and needs to be made new again is just half the problem confronting the region. The other daunting problem confronting the New England grid, and we've already touched on this, is that it will have to double in size over the next 25 years to meet the region's future demand for power. To give you a sense of how much it will cost to double the size of the grid, I want to focus now specifically on the electric transmission system, the 9,000 miles of high voltage lines that carry electricity from where it is generated to where it is needed, to every city and town in New England. Much of the total cost of making the transition to the future grid will be the cost of building transmission. Today's transmission system is configured to handle the current historical peak of 28 gigawatts. According to ISO New England, the region's electric grid operator, transmission system capacity will have to expand by 2050 to accommodate a peak that is twice as large as today's peak. ISO New England estimates that the annual peak will increase to 35 gigawatts by 2035, and that it will cost between $6 and $8 billion to build out this transmission system to accommodate it. By 2040, ISO New England estimates peak demand will be 43 gigawatts, and that the region will invest between $12 and $14 billion to build out the transmission to handle that peak. And by 2050, ISO New England is estimating that the annual peak will be between 51 gigawatts and 57 gigawatts, and that it will cost between $16 billion and $26 billion to expand the transmission system to meet a peak that large. ISO New England's estimate for the total amount of investments that will have to be made by 2050 varies by an enormous amount, $10 billion. But this difference of $10 billion doesn't result just from uncertainty about the future. The amount the region ultimately spends to build out the grid, whether the final cost will be closer to $16 billion rather than $26 billion, will depend on the choices that we make today. Right now, there's every indication that the region is on track to spend far more than we need to. I want to touch briefly on two examples of how the decisions that we make today will determine the ultimate cost of building the future grid. The first is what are called asset condition projects. The second is a proposal for an independent transmission monitor. As I mentioned earlier, the region's transmission system is decades old, 40 to 70 years old. Asset condition projects are implemented to repair, refurbish, or replace aging legacy transmission in existing rights-of-way. Between 2016 and 2023, the amounts spent each year on asset condition projects increased dramatically, from $58 million in 2016 to nearly $800 million in 2023. Between 2016 and February of 2023, $2.8 billion in asset condition projects have been completed, and another $3.3 billion in asset condition projects had been proposed, planned, or were then under construction. This increase in the amounts being spent on asset condition projects is increasing how much customers pay each month for electricity. Grid charges now account for approximately 10 to 15% of customer bills. Despite the dramatic increase in spending on asset condition projects in recent years, they receive very little oversight. Asset condition projects are presented to ISO New England's Planning Advisory Committee, but they are often submitted for review just 90 days before construction is scheduled to commence. NESCO, the New England States Committee on Electricity, has stated that not a single asset condition project has been denied or modified after presentation to the Planning Advisory Committee. Asset condition projects are scoped for the limited purpose of repairing or replacing legacy transmission lines. They do not take into account future need for transmission capacity on those lines. This often results in missed opportunities to expand the capacity of the transmission system we have now. Failing to increase the capacity of transmission in existing rights-of-way will inevitably increase the need for new transmission in new rights-of-way, with all of the associated environmental, cost, and community impacts that come with new construction. Finally, transmission owners are not required to right-size or future-proof their asset condition projects to anticipate the need for future capacity. Currently, there is a proposal to establish an independent transmission monitor to better plan future investments in the transmission system. The ITM would have several roles, but all of them would support transmission planning and cost containment. An ITM would review transmission projects, including asset condition projects, to verify the need for and scope of individual projects, confirm that each project supports long-term transmission planning, minimizes environmental and siting impacts by evaluating project alternatives, and reduce the aggregate cost of building the future grid. I hope that these two examples, asset condition projects and proposals for an independent transmission monitor, highlight the divergent paths the region can take as it builds the grid it needs to sustain the region's economy and regional prosperity. On the one hand, asset condition projects. Less than 10 years ago, they cost millions of dollars per year. Now their cost is measured in the billions of dollars. On the other hand, a proposal for an independent transmission monitor, an entity that would ensure comprehensive planning, maximize transmission capacity with the least amount of impact on communities and the environment while minimizing costs. But the independent transmission monitor is currently just a proposal. The success or the failure to create an independent transmission monitor highlights how much planning for the future grid is in play and why there is so much uncertainty about the ultimate cost of building out the grid the region will need. At this point, it might be worth pausing to think about where we are in our agenda for the webinar. We've talked about the remaking of the electric grid that is currently underway. We've just talked about asset condition projects and the proposal for an asset condition monitor to give us some sense of what is at stake in current grid policy development and to convey the importance of and need for participation in the making of grid policy. We have yet to consider how it is possible for communities to engage in meaningful stakeholder engagement given their acutely limited resources. Before we do that, Carolyn will take a look at New England communities and the historic role that communities played in the creation of the grid.
Thanks, Joe. There are 1,519 cities and towns in New England. Those cities and towns are home to more than 15 million people, and they sustain a regional economy that produces $1.5 trillion in goods and services annually. It is New England's 1,519 communities, yours included, for which the grid was built, and it's those same communities that it serves. It is in our communities, large and small, where the region's 15 million residents live and work, and it's in those communities, large and small, that host the region's $1.5 trillion economy. The well-being of every New Englander, the prosperity of our communities, and the prosperity of our regional economy as a whole all depend on the ability of the electric grid to produce and deliver power that is both reliable and affordable. It's impossible to overstate the extent to which each New England community and the entire regional economy depend on the electric grid. Communities should be at the center of grid policy development, not only because the welfare of New Englanders and the continuing prosperity of the New England economy depends on them. Communities should be at the center of grid policy development because it was communities that the grid was first created more than a century ago. The grid wasn't developed as part of some large national works project. Neither was its construction guided by a single agency or a grid czar. The grid grew organically, community by community, to serve those communities. And it was those community grids that were stitched together to achieve economies of scale and to support mutual aid, and that ultimately became the macro grid that we're familiar with today. One of the best books telling the story of the role of communities in the development of the grid is Electrifying America by historian David Nye. Nye devotes an entire chapter of the book to the electrification of Muncie, Indiana, because as Nye puts it, most of the country electrified much as Muncie did. Muncie's electrification story is important because it shows the essential role that communities played in the creation of the grid, and it's worth a quick retelling. The first electric lights were installed in Muncie in 1885. In that year, local business owner James Boyce purchased a small generator made by Thomas Edison and used it to power a block of buildings that he owned. People flocked to Boyce's buildings, as Nye puts it, to see the light. In 1892, Muncie businessmen installed 100 streetlights and published a pamphlet boasting that Muncie was the best lighted and heated city in the country. Muncie, population 25,000, had its first utility, a street lighting utility. By 1895, the privately held Citizens Street Railway Company was operating 27 electric trolleys on 15 miles of track. But the trolleys didn't run at night, and so the streetcar company began selling nighttime power to home and business owners. In 1898, James Boyce's electric company became the Muncie Electric Light Company. By 1900, Muncie, a town still with a population of just 25,000, had no fewer than 3 competing power utilities: the Muncie Electric Light Company, the Municipal Street Lighting Utility, and the Streetcar Company. By 1904, Muncie's electric utilities began to consolidate. The Municipal Street Lighting Utility was sold, and it was eventually became part of the New York-based Electric Holding Company of America, which brought power into Muncie from now an interstate grid. In 1935, both Indiana and the federal government created rural electrification programs to deliver power to the relatively few remaining Americans that were still without it. Electricity was becoming ubiquitous. It was being delivered by utilities that were consolidating and becoming regulated monopolies. And so the grid was built in precisely this way, community by community, mile by mile, all across the country. Why tell this story? To emphasize that today, just as it was then, the grid was built and exists to serve communities. Though it's privately owned, it is a public good and it's publicly regulated for just that reason. Our next topic is the electric grid and who is responsible for it. And for that, I'll turn it back over to Joe.
Thank you again, Carolyn. We're about to consider how it is possible for communities to engage in meaningful stakeholder engagement given their acutely limited resources. Before we do, it's important to answer a fundamental question. Who's responsible for it? The answer to that question is a straightforward one. We are responsible for it. That is, we as individuals, members of communities, and participants in the regional economy, we are the beneficiaries of the services the grid provides, and that puts us in a position to influence the development of grid policy and planning and how efficiently the grid will be built. This leads to another obvious question. How exactly do we exercise our influence? That raises practical considerations concerning time and resources. But before offering some strategies to overcome the obstacles that scarce time and resources present, I want to acquaint you with the two entities responsible for grid policy and planning, the two entities responsible for building the future grid. They are the New England Power Pool, called NEPOOL, and ISO New England, the region's grid operator. Participating in the development of grid policy and planning means engaging with both of them, because together NEPOOL and ISO New England will determine the pace and the cost of building the future grid. NEPOOL is ISO New England's principal stakeholder group. It is divided into 6 groups called sectors, comprising power plant owners, transmission owners, companies that purchase and resell electricity, municipally owned utilities, renewable energy and energy services companies, and last, but certainly not least, end users. That is, electricity customers, including individuals, cities and towns, and commercial customers, from the smallest storefront to the largest manufacturers. NEPOOL's members inform grid policy and planning and recommend those policies and plans to ISO New England. ISO New England, with very few exceptions, accepts NEPOOL's policy recommendations, often after recommending modifications of its own. ISO New England, in turn, is responsible for power system planning, wholesale energy market design, and the reliable day-to-day operation of the grid. It forecasts the region's future demand for electricity and plans additions to the grid to accommodate that future demand. When it comes to the electric grid, ISO New England is the entity that is responsible, in effect, for rebuilding the airplane while it's still in flight. To put the relationship of NEPOOL and ISO New England simply, NEPOOL is where grid policy is made, and ISO New England is where grid policy is implemented. Acadia Center is a voting member of NEPOOL's end user sector and participates together with NEPOOL's other member stakeholders in the development of grid policy. Is it necessary to influence regional grid policy directly by becoming a member of NEPOOL's end user sector? No. Indirect participation, especially coordinated indirect participation, can be every bit as effective as direct participation. That brings us to the purpose of Acadia Center's Communities and Clean Grid program. That purpose is to ensure the unique stakeholder interests of New England's municipal governments are fully represented in ISO New England and NEPOOL proceedings. It is what is at stake in the current grid transformation: security, competitiveness, resilience, and cost, the four values that we touched on earlier, that underlie the need for municipal stakeholder engagement. NEPOOL and ISO New England grid policy will determine the future cost of electricity, the siting of transmission lines and other energy infrastructure, and the fulfillment of municipal climate, environmental justice, and economic development goals. And that brings us to the goal of the Communities and Clean Grid program: to foster the alignment of NEPOOL and ISO New England policy with the specific needs of local communities, and to make certain the specific needs of the region's cities and towns are met as work on remaking of the electric grid proceeds. But there are obstacles to community engagement. We've already identified the most obvious one: the lack of time and resources. Is there really enough time in the day to follow every twist and turn of NEPOOL and ISO New England policy developments? Of course not. And even if there were time to devote to it, how long would it take to learn enough about specific policies to know which ones were of particular concern or were particularly relevant to municipal interests? How would it be possible to tell which policies might benefit cities and towns and which might impair them? How long would it take to contextualize what is going on at NEPOOL and ISO New England? And even if there were enough time and resources to devote to grid policy, even enough time to learn whether specific proposals might be good or bad for New England cities and towns, how could an individual city or town acting on its own hope to move the needle? How could any single city or town acting on its own possibly influence outcomes at NEPOOL or ISO New England? These are real and daunting obstacles, to be sure, but they're not insurmountable. There are clear strategies to overcome each one of them. The first strategy is to provide municipal officials with digested, contextualized materials summarizing NEPOOL and ISO New England proceedings. This would allow municipal officials to remain abreast of relevant, important grid issues with a minimum, manageable investment of time and effort. The next strategy is to issue selective calls to action to the region's cities and towns to participate in pending NEPOOL and ISO New England proceedings that are immediately relevant, good and bad, to municipal interests. That is, to issue calls to action when action would have the most impact and would offer the possibility of influencing outcomes. The final strategy is to coordinate the participation of cities and towns in NEPOOL and ISO New England proceedings so that they can engage collectively rather than independently on grid issues. This will magnify the role of cities and towns as stakeholders in regional grid planning and multiply and reinforce the influence cities and towns can have shaping the development of grid policy. Having heard these strategies to overcome the obstacles to community engagement on grid issues, I'm sure you're eager to hear how they can be put into action. Most, if not all of you, are already members of municipal associations or councils of government or other municipal networks and depend on them to provide information about policy developments that are relevant to you in areas such as land use, housing, education, transportation, state aid, and so on. Acadia Center's Communities and Clean Grid program is seeking to partner with those organizations so that they can provide that same service regarding regional grid issues that they already provide regarding other issues of public policy that are of immediate importance to you. In addition to keeping you informed about policy developments, municipal associations also issue calls to action for you to engage on legislation and policy initiatives of importance to you, and will be equipped to issue similar calls to action to participate in NEPOOL and ISO New England proceedings. And of course, municipal associations facilitate collective action on behalf of their member communities, enhancing the capacity of each of its members to influence outcomes. Those communities that do have the resources to engage on NEPOOL and ISO New England policies are welcome to partner with Acadia Center. If you wish, and if you're able to, we'd be happy to work with you directly. Now that we're at the end of the presentation, and I want to thank you for your time and your attention, I want to offer some final thoughts. I hope we've conveyed the magnitude of the grid transformation that is currently underway and its significance to New England's cities and towns. The grid will double in size and capacity over the next 25 years with associated economic, land use, and environmental impacts on local communities. It is not a matter of if it will happen, but how it will happen, and whether the region's cities and towns will have a seat at the tables where decisions about the course of that transformation will be made. Those decisions will be made, after all, whether or not cities and towns participate as stakeholders in the development of grid policy. New England communities have a choice to make: to be the passive recipients of grid policy developed for them, or to be active participants in developing grid policies that they inform to ensure those policies are aligned with their individual and collective interests. Communities hosted the creation of the grid, they can play an equally significant role in remaking it. And now onto the Q&A. Please let us know what specific questions or concerns you have. If something occurs to you later on, feel free to let us know. You'll find our contact information on the final slide.
Okay, well, thanks, Joe. I am going to prime our conversation, our Q&A today, while folks maybe have a few minutes to add any questions to the Q&A section. And just to be clear, it's not the chat function, it's the Q&A function, which is, there's a button at the bottom of your screen. But to start us off, Joe, I'm gonna give you a question here. At least some communities will need to host new transmission lines in their community that are planned and executed through the process that you just mentioned. Are there any federal or state requirements to consult municipalities on project proposals in the planning process?
Yes, there are. FERC recently issued an order, Order 1920, which is a long-term transmission planning process. And in its order, FERC carved out space for and a requirement for transmission developers to engage with municipalities regarding the siting of new transmission. So this is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the federal government, recognizing the role that communities will play in grid development, and making certain and requiring that transmission owners engage with municipalities as part of the process of developing new transmission. And of course, that means community meetings and stakeholder engagement directly with municipal leadership. It's probably worth adding too that at the same time that FERC is issued Order 1920 regarding long-term transmission planning, the region itself developed its own long-term transmission policy planning called LTTP. And the LTT process is really a parallel of the federal process I just described with Order 1920. And ISO New England recently just issued the first RFP under the LTT process. And it included in an appendix to the RFP a metric for evaluating developers' plans to engage with communities as part of the overall evaluation of the RFPs they're going to propose. But unfortunately, the RFP does not require developers to submit plans regarding how they intend to engage with communities. So, that is, a piece that we feel was missing from the LTTP process as it was configured in the current RFP.
Thanks, Joe. We got another good one here. Can you talk a little bit more about the independent transmission monitor concept? Who would set that up? Is it done in each state? And kind of what is the current status of that conversation right now?
I think the current status of that conversation is early stage. The concept was originally raised in a FERC proceeding. In fact, it was the FERC proceeding that ultimately yielded Order 1920. And FERC solicited comments on the notion of having a monitor reviewing transmission development in the various regions around the country. Then, during the course of the proceeding, however, FERC turned its focus away from the independent transmission monitor to continue work on the long-term transmission planning process. But ever since that first initial conversation that was started by FERC, the conversations here in the region have been ongoing, and the uh, the conversations are happening mostly at the state level. I will say that the way Acadia Center imagines the independent transmission monitor working, it would be the ITM would be looking across transmission processes, and there are several transmission processes here in the region. ISO New England is responsible for regional system planning processes, and transmission owners are responsible for asset condition projects and for local reliability projects. And we feel that the ITM should be looking across all of the planning processes. We conceive of the ITM as having a regional role. However, it would be up to the individual states whether or not they feel that a similar entity could be created within the states to manage transmission development that is occurring within the boundaries of the state.
Thanks, Joe. We got another question here about affordability, and I'll just read what the questioner put here. If transmission is planned prudently, it will presumably help to keep electricity costs down, which we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which is critical to affordability. What are the other types of benefits that communities could expect from hosting transmission infrastructure?
Well, communities are engaged in making certain that they're making the transition to a clean energy environment. And we're seeing this with the adoption of EVs and the transition of heating from gas and propane and oil to heat pumps, all of which are going to require more electricity. And of course, there's always the need for additional amounts of electricity that comes as a result of having an economy that's just simply growing. So the benefit of hosting transmission is really making certain that there is capacity for the economy to continue to grow and to prosper. And to do that while making certain that the cost of expanding the grid remains manageable, both for municipal budgets, but also for the residents of the cities and towns and the businesses in the cities and towns that depend on the grid.
Yeah, and just adding one additional point in addition to addressing increased or growing needs for electricity for economic reasons and affordability. There's also reliability benefits to having expanded and enhanced grid, transmission level grid infrastructure. There's, if you look at some of these recent and increasingly, impactful storms that we've seen across the U.S., allowing the system to connect to other regions of the country that might be able to provide electricity and sort of be larger than the storms that have to be managed or accounted for when electricity planning also provides or can provide benefits to local communities as well. So it's really, there are quite a few benefits that come from these investments and doing them smartly and well planned. Folks can feel free to add any additional questions. I have another one here. How do you see the role of microgrids in this structure? That's an interesting question, Joe.
Yeah, I think microgrids are really about well, I think of them primarily as being about resilience. And because any off-taker from a microgrid is essentially prepared to island itself from the larger grid. But that said, microgrids depend on distributed energy resources to be powered. So it could be solar, it could be a fuel cell, but some generation unit. And those distributed energy resources that are on the microgrid, when the microgrid is connected to the larger grid, it's very seldom that microgrids operate entirely independently of the larger grid. But when the microgrid is working in tandem with the larger grid, then those distribution energy resources that are installed as part of the microgrid can serve as grid assets for the larger system. And that ability of the distributed energy resources to serve the larger grid, of course, depends on transmission. And so it's really not, microgrids really aren't separate, discrete systems. They are actively participating with the larger grid, and in that way, in that sense, they're symbiotic with the larger grid and depend on the larger grid, I think.
I have another question here about aggregation, and this is a great question. Another great question for you, Joe, given your experience at the City of Boston with their municipal aggregation program. And so the question is, my community is subscribed to a community aggregation supply contract with a program administrator. Is it possible to leverage our participation in that program to address the issues you presented in this presentation?
Um, that's, so far there is no entity here in New England or using Massachusetts for an example. More than half of Massachusetts cities and towns are now municipally aggregated. And they are each executing contracts for power supply. And it's those, contracts that are used to deliver electricity to municipal aggregation customers. But in California, there are large numbers of municipal aggregations as well. But in California, there is a nonprofit entity that essentially is an aggregation, functions as an aggregation of aggregations. It offers services to the aggregations that achieve economies of scale that we can't achieve here in New England because here in New England, again, Massachusetts and New Hampshire, in particular, um, municipal aggregations are essentially acting independently to buy power and deliver services to their members. So I think that the fact that a city or town might have a municipal aggregation is really an indication that that city or town has begun to grapple with issues around power, how the power is sourced, how the power is delivered, and the affordability of that power. But I don't think that the aggregation itself would have any more influence than the municipal government that's hosting the aggregation. And so I think that in terms of stakeholder engagement, there wouldn't be separate stakeholder engagement on the part of municipal aggregations, but the stakeholder engagement would still remain primarily the responsibility of the municipality and the municipal officials who are hosting the aggregation.
Yeah, to build on that, also, Joe, the communities, cities and towns work with a municipal aggregator, a service provider that they work with to access those services. And I think, this is another opportunity for that aggregator to help participate in some of this, um, you know, collecting municipal feedback, working potentially with the Communities and Clean Grid program to really amplify the voices and the needs of municipal audiences in conversations at Need Pool and ISO New England. So part of our Communities and Clean Grid program, is to work to try and engage those service providers as well, along with municipal associations and other municipally affiliated organizations to support cities and towns in making sure that their voices and needs are represented in the process.
Mhm.
But that's a great question.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to add, looks like we've got one more question here. And this is really about staffing, municipal staffing. And you would reference, Joe, that one thing we heard when we've been speaking to municipalities is how resource constrained that they are. And one of the challenges of Communities and Clean Grid is to try to make it possible to, have municipal voices heard despite these resource constraints and try to support that. So this question says, how best should career staff of cities and towns be, who are aware of these issues, work with elected city and town officials as they change over and go through election cycles, and how best to make the case to local decision makers less familiar with grid issues. And I guess I'll take that question because I have served in a role like Joe as both a municipally elected official as well as at the state level. And this is really complex policy. There's a certain level of understanding and education that needs to happen before you can feel confident in engaging in these conversations, and how you maintain that level of understanding as you have turnover, whether that be in staff or in elected officials, is certainly part of the challenge. That's one of the things that we're hoping to overcome as part of the Communities and Clean Grid program, by making hopefully pretty easy to digest information available in sort of a data repository on our website, to continue to make these resources available so that as new staff, new folks come in to engage, they have a resource where they can go to get up to speed quickly, hopefully using language that's easy to access, start to understand kind of some of the cause and effect relationships that go into planning and investing in this infrastructure, so that we can really build outside capacity in our communities to fully engage in a way that really makes an impact. And as Joe had shown some of the cost trajectories of these investments, with a focused effort, we really believe that we can make sure that we're building out this new infrastructure as affordably and optimizing those investments as best we can. So that is all that we have for questions from the audience at this point. Just maybe wait another couple minutes. So Joe and I don't know, maybe if Sarah and Sam are doing a great job behind the scenes, maybe we could put up the final slide here, which gives the email address for both Joe and I. We are very eager to remain engaged with cities and towns, with any governmental or elected officials about these topics, to want to know what areas we can provide more information, how we can make sure that you have the tools in your hands to be able to make the voices of your constituencies heard. So feel free to reach out to us at any time at these email addresses. Like I said, we will be keeping our website up to date of new materials as we develop them, and hopefully, reaching out and promoting more educational opportunities like this.
Yeah.
So on that note, I don't know, Joe, any last comments to leave with our audience?
Oh, no, just to give my thanks. And it's been a real pleasure to be here with you all today. And yet, actually, do reach out if you have further questions. We're eager to engage with each and every one of you.
Sounds great. We got a great comment here that one of our participants will share with her folks at the municipal light plant, which we really appreciate. Thank you for joining.
Absolutely.
So on that note, just thank you all for making the time today during a busy lunchtime to join us. We hope you found the content and the material helpful. If you are familiar with municipal officials or a municipal light plant or a municipal association, please feel free to share this information, and we're happy to engage individually. We do offer a program through Communities and Clean Grid where we can provide a version of this presentation directly to a fully municipal audience that is geared and kind of tailored to that audience. So happy to do that. And please stay in touch. Like I said, we will make this presentation available and the recording on our acadiacenter.org website as well. So on that note, thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Good day, everybody.